Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to my updated Ayato guide for his rerun banner in patch 3.3. This video is going to be covering everything you need to know about Ayato, a very powerful and also very versatile 5-star hydro damage dealer who can be very efficient at applying hydro, dealing good damage, and enabling powerful reactions, especially with the release of the dendro element and the dendro related reactions that have come out since his last banner, which made him even better by giving him many more teams where he can be used as a really good option. While I covered some of that in my last video, today I'm going to be doing a deep dive on everything you need to know about Ayato regarding his best builds, weapons, teams, playstyles, and so much more. We're going to be covering them both inside and outside of dendro teams to give you guys the most complete guide possible for this character. Now, as always, before we begin, I want you to know that I do stream most nights on Twitch, link in the description if you're interested, and without further ado, let's get right into it. Alright, now starting things off, let's talk about Ayato's talents and abilities and how to actually play this character. Now, do keep in mind, since this is an updated guide, and he's a character who's been out for quite a while now, the way I'm going to proceed is by giving a brief recap on how his talents and abilities actually work, while putting an emphasis on the more important things and also the new things like how he's changed and how he's gotten better since his last banner, especially with the release of the dendro element, as well as give you guys tips on how to use them efficiently. So first of all, what does Ayato actually do? Well, as you may know by now, Ayato is an on-field hydro DPS who deals a significant amount of hydro damage and a pretty good AoE through his very powerful elemental skill that will infuse his normal attacks with hydro. His elemental skill is a stance change ability that actually has a pretty decent scaling on all of his attacks, converts them to hydro, lasts for 6 seconds, and only has a 12-second cooldown, which means you can stay on field with your Ayato for at least 6 seconds, and then swap out of him, use all of your support character's abilities, and then go back into him for another rotation. If that wasn't enough, this ability will also provide you with resistance to interruption, which is extremely convenient as it means you're not going to get knocked around everywhere, as well as an additional scaling based on your Ayato's max HP. Now, do keep in mind, and we will talk about this in the build section a bit later, that attack percent is still more efficient to build than HP as the scaling is better, but this just means that having a bit of HP on your artifacts isn't actually bad and can be a bonus, which makes them easier to build. If that wasn't enough, when you first use your elemental skill, there's a water illusion that is placed, which will explode if there's enemies around you or after 6 seconds, and apply hydro onto them and do a pretty decent amount of damage, which is especially nice for the additional hydro application that it does give you. Overall though, this ability is the main part of your kit. It does really good damage and also will provide you with a decent amount of energy, making your Ayato a very good on-field driver or DPS. If that wasn't enough, his elemental burst is a pretty nice ability that I view as complementary to his kit, but can also enable another playstyle, which we'll talk about shortly, revolving more so around his burst. In fact, the way this ability works is it basically just creates this rain field that will rain down hydro damage to everything inside of it with a pretty okay scaling, but also and especially an incredibly long duration. This ability lasts for 18 seconds and has a 20-second cooldown, giving it very little downtime, while also increasing the normal attack damage to your on-field character. Because of that, it will buff your Ayato when he's inside of it, while also applying hydro, dealing decent damage, and lasting a very long time. A few things to keep in mind with this ability though are that the energy cost is high, it's 80, and his burst does have a long animation, which can make it a bit weird to use sometimes, but it is still definitely a really good ability, and one that you're typically using either every rotation or every other rotation. Lastly, other things you should know about Ayato are that he gains energy from off-field if he has less than 40 energy through a passive talent. On top of that, since your elemental skill is a stance change and you'll have new scalings on your normal attacks, it is therefore going to be pretty useless to level your normal attacks unless you plan on playing physical for some reason, so you can really focus on your skill and your burst in terms of talent priority and ignore your normal attacks. And so that is pretty much it for his talent rundown. Now, where things get a bit more complicated, or I guess a bit more important to know, is actually regarding how to make the most use out of your Ayato and what his playstyles actually are. Well, first things first, since Ayato's main role is being an on-field auto attacker, you can use him paired with off-field supports who can apply a ton of either like dendro, electro, or whatever, while your Ayato's on-field applying hydro, causing powerful reactions, and dealing really good damage. His main go-to team before the release of dendro was electrocharge. You'd pair him with electro supports like Fischl, Beto, or others, and these teams would perform quite well, and they honestly still do. What's even nicer though is that now Ayato has an even more prevalent role in the meta with the release of the new dendro element, as he is going to be the go-to on-field hydro applier in pretty much every dendro team. Unless you want a healer like Kokomi, Ayato shines really well. A good example of this is basically any bloom variation being either Hyperbloom or Burgeon, where you put your Ayato on field with a dendro support and then either an electro one or a pyro one, depending on if you want to proc Hyperbloom or Burgeon, and then these teams can deal insane amounts of damage, especially Hyperbloom in single target being, in my opinion, a pretty broken reaction. While his main meta teams are with either dendro or electrocharged, he can also be viable in pretty much any hydro reaction based team, including being paired with pyro characters or crowd characters for vaporize or freeze. While those aren't as optimal, and I will go more into this in the team section, they're still viable in the sense that yes, you'd rather use Kokomi for freeze, and yes, you'd rather use Child for Shangling, but if you only have one 5-star hydro, then Ayato is probably the most flexible one as he works everywhere, while also being the best for dendro reaction teams generally speaking, and also electrocharged. And so that is Ayato's main role and the one we were primarily going to cover in this video. With that said, I also wanted to quickly mention an off-field Ayato build, which while it isn't as popular and I don't recommend it to every player, I do think is underrated in certain teams teams, like for example certain freeze variations, and especially like in Nilou and Nahida Bloom teams where you're running Nilou, Nahida, a Hydro healer, and then another off-field Hydro support, which can be a single target one like Yelan or Xingqiu, but could also be a nice AoE Hydro field that lasts for 18 seconds with Ayato's burst. Also, before moving on, I wanted to add a quick tip regarding if you want to use Ayato's burst and then swap for either an off-field support build, or if you just for some reason want to just use his burst. Something you should know is that you can use your skill at the start, do an auto attack, and then burst, and then do another auto attack. And as you can see, and I can sort of slow down the footage there to show you, is that you'll get energy from your first hit of your skill before your burst, and then you'll also gain another particle from the hit after your burst. So that's a quick way to just get a bit of energy for free if you're going to use your burst and swap out anyways, which is especially useful to know if you plan on using Ayato primarily for his burst. Alright, now moving on, let's talk about how to actually build your Ayato. Ayato is a character who is very flexible in his builds because he has many good artifact sets that all perform very similarly, which means he can be a pretty easy and resin efficient character to farm for. In fact, he has 3 main traditional go-to sets, being 4-piece Echoes, 4-piece Heart of Depth, and 4-piece Gladiator. All 3 of these sets perform very similarly, so you can usually pick the ones that have the better subsets for you, as it will all significantly buff your normal attack damage. Which one is better for you does depend on a few factors, which I'll mention briefly, but before we get into that, I also wanted to mention other artifact sets, like 4-piece Thundering Fury for Electrocharge teams, as this set gives you a bit of reaction damage while also decreasing your skill's cooldown, 4-piece Blizzard Strayer for freeze teams, 4-piece Emblem for more niche off-field burst DPS/support builds, or lastly mix and matching some of the 2 pieces that I mentioned earlier, like Heart of Depth with any attack percent set. Now with all those sets mentioned, because they're all very viable and dependent on your situation, let's actually dive into which set is right for you, especially comparing Echoes, Heart of Depth, and Gladiator. Now the first thing you need to know is regarding Echoes of an Offering. This set is the one technically made for Ayato. It's really good. It buffs your normal attacks as you normal attack. Like there's a chance that you trigger a Value Right effect, which will increase your normal attack damage by 70% of your attack, but it is a chance, and every time it doesn't proc, the chance of it proccing on the next hit will increase by 20%, and I believe the effective average proc rate is around 50%. However, do note that this proc rate actually depends on your ping for some reason, which I find really dumb, but basically the way this set works is that you shouldn't be using it if your ping is too high, like above 100, it becomes less efficient, and this is basically because of the way the triggers actually proc, so you want to be on lower ping to use a set, which as I said, I find very stupid, but it's just how it works. So if you are lower ping, it is his best in slot. It gives you attack percent and also buffs your normal attack damage, being the best set for your Ayato. Now with that said, it is only marginally better than the other sets. It's very comparable in strength, like genuinely only a few percents ahead sometimes, while also being in a pretty resin inefficient domain, being paired with Vermilion, which is a set only used on Shao pretty much, which is why I typically recommend most Ayato players using the other sets they probably already farmed for, like 4-piece Glad or Heart of Death. With that said, I obviously have an amazing Echo set because as you probably know, I've spent so much resin on Vermilion for Shao that my Ayato got built in the process. And if you're wondering regarding the comparison between Glad and Heart of Depth in particular, Glad gives you a bit more attack and Heart of Depth gives you a bit more damage percent, so whichever your weapon gives you more of can determine which set will be slightly better, in the sense of if you already have a lot of damage percent, then getting a bit of attack percent to diversify can be better, and the opposite is true with an attack percent weapon. Generally though, they are very similar in strength, all 3 of Heart of Depth, Glad, and Echoes, so really do pick which ones you have better substats on, with also mix and matching their 2 pieces being viable as well, on top of the other 4 pieces that I mentioned for certain niche team comps. Lastly, keep in mind that all the 4 pieces I mentioned earlier are viable in their niches, with Thundering Fury being one that I especially wanted to mention for taser teams as a potential best in slot for your Ayato, given the reaction damage and the cooldown decrease on your skill. This set can also work in certain Hyperbloom teams where you're running 2 electro characters, because it'll give you more Hydro application, more uptime on your elemental skill, which can make it nice for your Ayato when paired with multiple electro characters. Alright, now with the artifact sets out of the way, what stats do you actually want on your Ayato? Well, first things first, as I mentioned in the talent section, attack percent is going to be your main scaling, so this is definitely going to be better than HP percent, in case that's something you were wondering. Because of that, the main stats you want for your damage are going to be attack percent, crit damage, and crit rate. With that in mind, you also need energy recharge in order to use your burst as often as you would want to. Now, how often you use your burst and what team comp you're running will highly affect how much energy recharge you need, making it incredibly variable. What I mean by this is some Ayatos will use their burst every rotation, for example, either off-field Ayato teams or teams where you swap into them less often. Generally speaking though, given how much energy recharge you would need if you only use your skill once per burst, I usually recommend using your skill twice per burst, or just using your burst whenever you have it up. For example, using your burst at the start of your rotation, using your skill, swapping out, coming back, using your skill again, and then using your burst when it's up. Again though, this rotation is something that I will touch on briefly a bit later in the video, and also highly depends on your team, so again, how much energy recharge you need will highly vary. With that said, I generally don't recommend building too much energy recharge, as Ayato is a very efficient character with only his elemental skill, which is why while you shouldn't neglect your burst, you shouldn't feel forced to use it with every skill, as I personally would prefer to use your skill like twice in every rotation, but again, this depends on your team and stuff, and I don't want to repeat myself. Because of that, I'll put general ER ranges on screen now, but do keep in mind that it's usually around 130 to 150 150 or 160 energy recharge, usually around that range for an on-field Ayato build, with your energy recharge needs significantly increasing to around 200% or even more for an off-field Ayato build if you choose to use your Ayato primarily for his burst and rarely swap into him. Once you have enough ER though, focus on stacking damage, so attack percent, crit damage, crit rate primarily, but also HP percent and elemental mastery can be nice as well. Because of that, you want attack percent on your sands, hydro damage bonus on your goblet, and then either crit rate or crit damage on your circlet, depending on what you need more of. Next up, let's talk about Ayato's weapons and cover the best ones for every player. Starting things off, his best install weapons are going to be the 5-star offensive crit ones, like his signature Rerun, the Jade Cutter, and Mist Splitter. Now, regarding the differences between these three weapons, keep in mind that the two first ones, the crit rate ones, are typically going to be his two best in slots, with the Rerun being usually slightly better because of the sheer amount of crit rate it gives you, the elemental damage bonus, as well as the normal attack damage increase on the effect pretty easily by just using your elemental skills on your other party members. Similarly, the Jade Cutter gives you a ton of crit rate, even more actually, while also giving you additional buffs based on your HP. And while this doesn't make HP better than attack by any means, it's still nice because Ayato also has a bit of HP scaling, which will just make that extra substat less useless and just give you more damage overall. Because of that, these are your two go-to options, with Mist Splitter not being too far behind, especially if you need more crit damage in your ratio. It is a good weapon for you. The only problem with the Mist Splitter is that the effect can be a bit difficult to stack for Ayato, have a bit lower uptime. For example, the stack you gain when you use your elemental burst only lasts for 10 seconds and your burst has a 20-second cooldown, so keep something like that in mind. But in general, the sheer amount of stats that it gives you still makes it one of Ayato's best options, and a very good one at that. Now, if you don't have a 5-star weapon, fear not, there's pretty decent 4-stars, especially if you buy the battle pass. Like Black Sword is a really good option for your Ayato, giving you a ton of crit rate, as well as a 20% increase to your normal attack damage at refinement rank 1, obviously increasing with refinement, while also healing you when you do crit. Do keep in mind though that the difference from a R1 to an R5 Black Sword isn't the most. It's around like 5 to 7% usually, to where you can be content with only an R1 Black Sword as a pretty accessible option if you do buy the battle pass. With that said, other good weapons include a Lion's Roar, especially refined in teams where you're fighting opponents affected by either Pyro or Electro, so typically Electro charged taser teams are those where you can use the Lion's Roar. For your free-to-play options, well, they're not the best, but they are decent in the sense that you can use the Aminoma for just a stat stick of attack percent while also giving you some energy after you use your elemental burst. Now, do keep in mind, if you use your burst at the start of your rotation, which you typically do on Ayato, this passive will only work for the next rotations in the sense that you need to stack up your skill before you gain energy from your burst. So at the start, it won't be that efficient, but for longer fights, it can be nice. The Harbinger of Dawn, if you're running a shield character or can maintain high HP, is also a good option for the crit rate and crit damage that it gives you. Next up, I also wanted to mention this weapon right here, known as the Cursed Blade, which is a weapon that I believe you get during Kazuha's story quest, and it can be the best free-to-play option for your Ayato if you don't need the energy recharge that the Aminoma gives you. In fact, it's just a pretty standard attack percent weapon that gives you attack on its stats, and then its effect will give you an additional AoE damage hit while also increasing your attack by 15% when you do land a normal attack. Because of that, it's a pretty decent free-to-play option, but it isn't anything amazing. It's just a decent amount of attack percent, which can be nice. Now, granted, the same can be said about pretty much any offensive weapon, like also the Black Cliff Longsword, which is pretty decent for crit damage, high base attack, and also an effect giving you attack percent when you defeat an opponent. Lastly, some other options that I wanted to mention are the Summit Shaper, especially if you're shielded, as it just gives you a ton of attack percent, so it's really not bad. And also, if you need a lot of energy recharge, the Skyward Blade can also be an okay option, although it typically isn't your go-to. Now, with that said, I will put a weapon ranking on screen right now for both Ayato in a Hyperbloom team and Ayato in an Electro Charge team comp. Now, do keep in mind, the exact weapon ranking does highly vary based on your team, rotation, how you play your characters, and what enemies you're fighting, as well as your artifact sets and substats, so only take this as a general idea, as with every weapon ranking in my videos. Overall though, as you can see, the 5-star weapons are very good for Ayato, especially the main 3 we talked about, as well as Black Sword being a great battle pass option, and the Aminoma being a decent free-to-play one, but unfortunately Ayato is someone who does gain quite a bit of value with 5-star weapons, although obviously don't feel forced to pull for them, as even with a 4-star weapon, Ayato is a very good character. Additionally, keep in mind that as mentioned earlier, Mist Splitter's value does go up or down depending on your uptime of its effect, as the uptime can be a bit wonky with Ayato, but even without the best uptime, it's still his 3rd best option, so still a good 5-star overall. Alright, now moving on, let's talk about Ayato's Constellations and cover how strong I believe they are. Now, as a disclaimer, I believe Ayato fulfills his role very well at C0, and none of his Constellations are that big of an increase, in case that's what you're wondering, so I wanted to get that out of the way. With that said, he has a few decent ones, like notably his C2 and 3 both giving you skill damage, with your second one increasing the stack count of your elemental skill and increasing your max HP, giving you around like a 10-ish% damage increase, with your 3rd Constellation giving you even more than that by just increasing your skills talent level. With that said, your 1st Constellation, the reason why I skipped over it is because overall it's not that big of a deal. It just helps you finish off opponents, giving your skill 40% more damage against opponents under half HP, which can be okay for finishing them off, but overall is not the biggest deal. Moving on, your 4th Constellation increases normal attack speed third of your party members inside of your burst, which is just okay overall, and your fifth constellation increases your burst talent level. Lastly, your sixth constellation is a pretty interesting one that will give your Ayato a bit of front-loaded burst damage that you can vaporize by making the first hit inside of your skill deal 2 extra hits that all have a really high scaling, allowing you to deal a significant amount of damage right after using your skill. Because of that, while this isn't the best C6 in the game, having a bit of front-loaded burst in your Ayato team can prove to be quite useful. Overall though, he's a very powerful unit even at C0, and so he's not someone whose constellations I really recommend pulling for, despite him having a few decent ones. Alright, now with all that out of the way, let's finally get into one of the most important sections of this video, which is regarding Ayato's best teams. Now the way this section is going to work is I'm going to give you guys the best team comps you guys can use for every reaction that Ayato's good in. We're going to talk about teams with and without dendro, and also teams where you're going to be using your Ayato on or off field. As we saw throughout the video, Ayato's main role is generally going to be an on-field hydro applier with a powerful burst as well, but mainly used for his fast hydro application and really good damage from on-field. Because of that, he's going to be the go-to on-field hydro option for pretty much any team comp that needs a hydro applier, especially for dendro. There are some exceptions, like for vape teams, child can be better, things like that, but in general, he's a really consistent option across many different reactions, so you can use him in so many different teams. Starting things off, I want to talk about dendro teams, where he excels in bloom teams with a dendro support, and then you can either run an electro character to hyperbloom it or a pyro character to burgeon it. Because of that, the way these teams are built are as follows. You're going to pair Ayato with a dendro support. Nahida obviously is the best if you have her, but if you don't worry, because the main character is honestly great here. A really good replacement to Nahida, not quite as good, but still good enough, as her burst applies a good amount of dendro from off field and also deals decent damage. Also, do keep in mind that while Cole is typically a worse version of the dendro main character for reasons that I've explained in other videos, she can actually work in certain Ayato teams if you want a 15-second rotation, as her burst has a 15-second cooldown as opposed to the main character's 20, and while she will apply less dendro, it can be enough in certain teams, and you can also run like the elegy for the end, so she is a viable option that I wanted to mention. Generally speaking though, the other two are going to be your dendro options, with the next slot being variable based on what reactions you want to play. You can pair an electro support if you want a hyperbloom, or a pyro support if you want a burgeon. The go-to electro support is typically going to be Kuki, as she's a healer and a really good hyperbloom applier as a 2-in-1. You can stack elemental mastery on her, deal surprisingly good hyperbloom damage just from being level 90 and having good elemental mastery, while also healing your team and being a great 2-in-1. Other options include an EM Raiden build if you just want to use her for her skill, technically Dory, although she's just a worse version of Kuki, or some other electro characters, but they typically don't hyperbloom as well. Like for example, Fischl doesn't hyperbloom that much, despite her damage being absolutely amazing and still a good option, for example, even in a 4th slot, which is the flex slot that we're about to talk about. In fact, in a team like this, your last slot can be so many different characters. You can do an emo character like Kazuo or Sucrose to swirl a bunch of things together, buff your hydro and electro damage, and also group enemies pretty easily. You can run another electro character, someone like Fischl or especially Beto, who won't steal too many hyperblooms while also providing you with really good off-field damage. The same can be said with the Ayamiko if you want to run 2 electros. You can even run a cryo support because of the way that cryo and dendro interact, where it's just a decent option, or you can run a second hydro. There's really so many different options, so you can choose what your team needs or what character you already have built. Personally, my favorite is typically going to be Kazuo, just because of how broken Kazuo is, but I also really do like double electro teams here, and also think that cryo characters are underrated. With that in mind, everything I just said in terms of the flex slot can apply to a burgeon team as well, but do keep in mind that in this team, you want to either make sure that your Thomas shield is decent enough to where you're not dying to your own burgeon reactions, or you can run any defensive option as your last slot, like someone like Jean, Zhongli, or others. Overall, those are going to be the 2 main Ayato dendro team comps. There is one other. If you have Nahida and Nilou and you're playing a bloom team, where you have your off-field hydro support like Kokomi or Barbara, both healing and blooming for you from off-field while your Nahida is applying dendro on-field, your last slot is going to be an off-field hydro applier who can be many different characters, but among them is an off-field Ayato build that honestly works surprisingly well. It's not typically my recommended playstyle, but it can actually work in this team comp, as his burst lasts for 18 seconds with a 20-second cooldown, so a very good uptime and a pretty decent off-field effect in this team comp. Moving on, for non-dendro teams, he actually still has good ones. While I do think his place in the meta got a lot better with dendro, he became even more versatile. He's still good in pretty much any reaction, with my favorite non-dendro one and the one I can typically recommend being an electrocharge team that he excels at. In fact, there's 2 variations. You can either go a standard electrocharge build where you pair him with 2 electro supports like Fischl and Beto, and then your last slot is going to be flexible, either Bennett or Jean if you need a healer, or a more offensive one like Kazuo or Sucrose can work nicely. Another variation of this sort of taser team is actually a soup team comp where you're mixing a bunch of elements together and proccing a few different reactions at the same time by pairing Bennett, Kazuo, Fischl, and Ayato all in one team. This team works surprisingly nicely and it's very easy to play. You just use a bunch of stuff together, try to swirl as many elements as you can with your Anemo support, and then have your Ayato on-field DPSing and enabling your other characters to deal good damage. Moving on, other viable teams that I don't like quite as much but that can work are first of all Vaporize. Again, Ayato is usually just a worse child in this team, as child applies more hydro Hydro, AoE, and has a really good burst, but Ayato can work here as a viable option if you don't have child. Moving on, he can also be a decent off-field support in freeze teams. Again, not the most meta option, but he can work with someone like Ganyu and Venti, whose bursts, alongside Ayato's, have quadratic scaling, so you can group enemies and deal a pretty good damage while freezing them all using your 3 bursts together. Overall though, as you can see, his team comps are very flexible. He can be used in pretty much any Hydro reaction, with my favorite being either Hyperbloom, Burgeon, or Electrocharged, or also like soup teams if that counts, depending on what you want to use. Do also keep in mind that a lot of these slots, as I mentioned, are flexible, so there's so many different options, so many different teams that you can create, with the one that I'm going to be showcasing being a Ayato Hyperbloom team that I'm going to use in the current floor 12 as being an amazing team comp overall, especially good in single target, being one of the best single target teams in the game, while also having decent AoE because of characters like Kazuha and also Ayato's skill. The Ayato I'm going to be using in the showcase is on a Jade Cutter C0 build with the 4-piece Echo set, well actually 5-piece because I farmed this domain so much, with level 9-7 talents, with a really good crit ratio of almost 92 crit rate, 220 crit damage, and almost 140 energy recharge. With that said, I hope this guide was helpful and I hope you'll enjoy the showcase. Let's go. And so yeah, that's about it. As you can see, it was more of a team showcase, showcasing the power of Hyperbloom, with a good on-field enabler though, Ayato, who does do a good amount of damage. Apologies for the slight delay on this video. I wanted it to be out by the banner's release, but unfortunately that wasn't possible, but I do hope it was helpful nonetheless. Personally, before ending this video, I do want to emphasize that I really enjoy Ayato. I think he's very fun, versatile, a flexible and strong unit who you can use in pretty much any Hydro team. Now, as always, if there's anything new I want to add regarding this video, it will be in a pinned comment, so be sure to check that. And with all of that being said, thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.